I've been looking forward to for so long, because we get very sort of sucked into our own species and our own countries, and we forget that each of them is part of a much bigger picture. And they throw this light around the world, both sort of in terms of our emotional response to them, but also in terms of shining a light on the big environmental issues of the day. So it will just be fascinating to hear what's going on around the world with the different species. And we have really wonderful speakers tonight, and I can't thank everybody enough for taking part. Just before we start, just for those of you who haven't joined before, I'm Mary Colwell. I'm Director of Curlew Action. Working all the cogs and wheels behind the scenes is Megan Shersby. And so anything technical, Megan has to deal with, don't ask me. And we have speakers from all the major curlew species that are extant at the moment. Poor old little curlew always gets left behind, but hopefully we'll be able to say something about that. But we won't be covering the slender-billed or the Eskimo, as they are both presumed extinct, and we have covered them in the previous one. So before I launch into the evening properly, please make sure everybody's got their camera and their sound off. I think that's been done. Please put your questions in the chat. That would be great. We'll have a session of Q&A at the end. So all questions in the chat. And shamelessly, an appeal, if anybody can please donate to Curlew Action to help us to keep hosting these webinars for free for everybody. We do about one a month, and we always get wonderful speakers. But it does take quite a lot of effort on our half, and we'd be very grateful for any support you can give us. So thank you. So without further ado, I'm going to start to introduce our speakers. The format of the evening is I'll introduce the speaker, who will then give us a presentation of around about between 5 and 9, 10 minutes at the most. We will then have a group discussion between us, and then I'll open it out to questions from the chat. So please make the most of having some of the greatest experts in the world of curlews before you this evening. So one of the real problems, or maybe it's not a problem, one of the real delights of living on a round planet and doing a webinar at a specific point is that somebody draws the short straw and has to get up in the middle of the night. And that joy fell to Professor Richard Fullar, who's in the School of Environment at the University of Queensland. So thank you so much, Richard, for turning up at 3:30 in the morning. But just in case, there was an issue and your alarm clock didn't go off, you sent us your presentation ahead of time on the Far Eastern Curlew. And so we'll play that now. So this is the presentation on the Far Eastern Curlew over in Australia. Thanks very much, Megan. We can start that one.
Hi, everyone. My name is Richard Fullar, and I'm reporting on the status of the Far Eastern Curlew. I'm an academic at the University of Queensland in Australia, and have been studying this species for a number of years. Unfortunately, it's one of the most endangered curlew species that's definitely not extinct. So it's in big trouble. There's been a huge amount of monitoring of migratory shorebirds across the Australian continent, which gives us a good index of how their populations are going throughout the Flyway. There's monitoring of high quality, more or less all around the Australian coast, with some gaps across the north. So much of the non-breeding range of the Eastern Curlew is covered by this monitoring activity. But the results from this monitoring are kind of horrible viewing, to be honest. Colin Studds did a big analysis of the national population trend for Eastern Curlew back in 2017, using data up until 2012. And at that time, the Eastern Curlew had declined at a rate equivalent to over 80% in 3 generations. There's debate about whether the species is correctly listed as critically endangered or endangered, but nevertheless, it's had an enormously strong and continued decline for very many years. And there are data from parts of Australia, from Tasmania, for example, which show it's gone from being commonplace to essentially extinct. So it's a species that's showing an incredibly negative population trajectory. In response to that, a project was launched a few years ago to fix satellite transmitters to eastern curlews to try and understand their migration routes and look at some of the threats that the birds are facing or avoiding along their migratory journeys. So birds were fitted with satellite tags from 4 locations from around Australia to track the migrations. And basically all the birds from all around the continent of Australia commenced their northward migration at roughly a similar time, but all of them went through the Yellow Sea and fed in the Yellow Sea as a stopover site on the way to the breeding grounds. And this confirms something that we've known for a very long time. The Yellow Sea region, that area between China and the Korean Peninsula, is an enormously important stopover site for not just the eastern curlew, but many other migratory shorebirds in this flyway. After feeding in that area, the birds push further north and breed in the Amur Basin. All of the Australian birds notably bred in the Amur Basin, apart from a couple of birds which went up to Sakhalin. So this gives us a clear handle on where eastern curlews from Australia are going. And the threats these birds are facing are enormous and varied along their migratory journey. This is an area that was once eastern curlew breeding habitat and is now intensively farmed rice paddies. And much of northeastern China in the Heilongjiang region, which was once prime eastern curlew habitat, has been converted in this way. So there's been a severe loss of breeding grounds, in particular within northeastern China, for this species. And it hangs on by a hair's breadth in China as a breeding bird. But the places it breeds in China are just now islands of habitat that remain in between large areas of rice paddy. So there's been enormous loss of breeding grounds for this species, which is not something that we hear often much about. Another emerging threat that a fantastic team of researchers coordinated by Birds Russia have recently revealed is enormous levels of hunting of eastern curlews in the Russian Far East. Here's a kind of estimate of shooting rates for eastern curlews in that region. You can see a lot of spatial variability and substantially large numbers of birds on Sakhalin being hunted. Apparently eastern curlews don't taste as good as whimbrels or teals, but they're regarded as highly prestigious birds by hunters. So there's a lot of competition and intense focus in Sakhalin in particular on shooting eastern curlews. And the Russian researchers estimate that around 2,000 eastern curlews are shot each year in this region. And for a species that probably numbers around 35,000 individuals, that is an incredibly high hunting rate. When these birds come down to Australia, they face disturbance all around the continent. Many of Australia's largest estuaries also have big cities near them, and eastern curlew is an incredibly disturbance sensitive species and really big concern that disturbance is a huge issue. But it seems that the main issue for eastern curlews is simply loss of habitat in the stopover region of the Yellow Sea as the birds migrate north and south. Vast areas of the Yellow Sea's mudflats have been converted through seawall construction and land reclamation and have been lost as intertidal habitat suitable for the curlews. Nick Murray did some satellite analysis showing that 2/3 of the intertidal mudflats in the Yellow Sea region have disappeared through reclamation and other processes over the last 50 years. That's 2/3 of the stopover habitat for this species has gone. And that's likely to be the most important driver of at least historical declines, but those other effects are important too. Now, we have seen in the recent decade and a half or so big advances in conservation activity for the eastern curlew and other species using the Yellow Sea. A major IUCN report, reports by the Paulson Institute, and have prompted significant action around the Yellow Sea on habitat conservation. And there has been the declaration of reclamation within China being stopped. That happened in 2018, in part for environmental reasons, also in part for economic reasons. But nevertheless, the rate of land reclamation in the Yellow Sea has dropped somewhat dramatically over the last 6 or 7 years or so, which is great news. On top of that, many of the important remaining sites in the Yellow Sea have been declared as World Heritage Properties, both in Korea and in China, which is a sign of, I think, excellent conservation progress. So I guess the big question on all of our minds is some of this conservation attention beginning to sort of bend the curve and slow the decline of the Eastern Curlew? Well, we very recently finished some updated trend analyses for the entire Australian continent, and it really does seem as if the decline of the Eastern Curlew has absolutely stabilised. Over the last decade, there has been no significant detectable change in Eastern Curlew numbers across the Australian continent, suggesting that the decline may have finally bottomed at last. We see no sign of recovery yet, but it appears that the rate of decline has slowed down dramatically. I see 4 important dimensions to achieving real recovery for this species. We really need to know more about the threats to this species on its breeding grounds. There's been much attention elsewhere. We know very little about what's happening up there on the breeding grounds. We need to continue to push to expand stopover habitat protections in the Yellow Sea. We need renewed efforts in Russia, but also elsewhere, to reduce hunting pressure on this species. It just can't take these levels of hunting. We also need much stronger disturbance mitigations in Australia and elsewhere. So are we making progress? Are we saving the Far Eastern Curlew? Well, I'd say we've started, but we certainly haven't yet finished the job. Thanks very much.
So that ending on a, what I call a hopeful note, that that at least the decline has stabilised, which is hopeful these days, isn't it? But that's fascinating, and so many big issues. Do you, in your heart of hearts, feel confident that we will hold on to it?
To be honest, it's still a tough call. If you'd asked me this question three or 4 years ago, I would have said we've got no hope. It's just falling like a knife, and that it's not going to recover. I've been surprised and delighted to see the signs of stabilisation in its numbers. But you know, the mathematician in me says that these hunting rates are so high, the habitat is still continuing to decline, that I think this bird is still under very severe pressure. So, you know, I hope that there are many, many good people working all around this flyway on the conservation, not just of this species, but of migratory shorebirds in general. So I think I'm kind of torn. I really hope so. I really do hope so, but it's going to need substantial and continued effort.
One more question before we move on. The Eurasian curlew sort of has a lot of love behind it. People know about it, or increasingly know about it. If you know about it, you love it. Is that the same for the Far Eastern?
Yes, I would say so. I think that over the last 15 to 20 years, I think there's been a kind of public awakening to the plight of migratory shorebirds, and in many ways, the Eastern Curlew is the kind of poster child for 50 or more migratory shorebirds that fly up and down this flyway. So I'd say yes, I think there is widespread public recognition. After the Australian government listed the species as critically endangered, that's provoked an awful lot of attention all around Australia, and much of that attention is kind of being exported elsewhere. So it comes up on development proposals all across the continent. People have to think about it all the time when they're planning coastal development. So yes, I'd say both public attention and I think kind of local, regional and national government attention, it has increased dramatically for this species and other shorebirds.
That's great. Well, hopefully a bit later on we'll go into a bit more specifics, because I really want to know what's happening to Toomba Harbour, isn't it? It's one of the big developments that was threatening it. But we'll save that for the discussion on the sort of the common threats that are facing curlew around the world. So thanks ever so much, Richard. That's great. We go whiz now straight round to the other great big continent, which we're going to look at the Whimbrel in America. So from one of the biggest curlews to a really small one. So Brad Winn, you are Vice President of Manomet, which is a conservation science organization in America. Could you tell us about the American Whimbrel?
Mary, thank you for inviting me to this group, and I'm very honored to be here and grateful to be able to share what we know about these birds. I want to start by saying that I'll be talking about the Western Atlantic population of Whimbrel, and not those that are more on this Pacific coast coming out of Alaska. So I'll be talking about the birds that are primarily wintering in the north coast of South America. So yeah, I need to immediately call attention to all the people that are actually working on this. I'm representing a pretty large group of people that have been working on Whimbrels and really increasing efforts in the last several years. Our main partner with Manomet is Brian Watts in the Center for Conservation Biology at the College of William and Mary in Virginia. And anybody who's interested in seeing the publications that we have been putting out, Brian and his staff have really been responsible for the majority of the publications that we've generated, and I'm very grateful to that. But we have other key partners in Georgia Department of Natural Resources, South Carolina Nature Conservancy, University of Oklahoma. Actually, their lab, they're mostly looking at flight dynamics, but they've been a really good partner. All the way to the bottom, some of my colleagues, Alan Neidel, Abby Sterling, and Charlotte Schulte, I need to mention as well. Okay. Yeah, sorry for the cartoon nature of this, but it hopefully will say what I need to say. But the group we're talking about is wintering in the north coast of South America, and the red lines going off to the left indicate their migration pathways, and there really are two distinct groups of birds as they leave, and the staging areas, one of them in the southeastern part of the U.S. on the coast. The other one is in the Gulf of Mexico, starting actually across the border in Mexico. It stretches all the way up into Louisiana. So we have two distinct areas, and what's really fascinating to many of us is the feeding on those staging areas going north is quite different. The ones on the South Atlantic are eating primarily fiddler crabs in the salt marsh, and those in the Gulf are actually flying inland and feeding on crayfish or crawfish from crawfish farms and rice farms as well. So they're leaving the coast, they roost in the coast at night and go inland, and the ones in the Atlantic are feeding heavily on fiddler crabs there. Migration tracks, this is again general, and the more we study these birds, the more overlap there is in these different sites, but the migration pathways seem to be distinct from the southeastern U.S. up into the Hudson Bay area, with one breeding area there, and then the other one is over there in Mackenzie River Delta area and actually into northern Alaska. So those birds seem to go and be quite site faithful to those two breeding areas. The southbound migration, again, seems to be split. There's staging areas as far north as Hudson Bay. Some of the islands in Hudson Bay, birds will stay there for a month at a time after post nesting, and then drop down into the Caribbean and South America. And the other ones from Alaska and Mackenzie River Delta will stage in the Canadian Maritimes and drop down across the Atlantic down into South America that way as well. But they are staging from Maritimes all the way down into Virginia actually, and some go periodically right into South Carolina on their way south. Those are the ones that cross down into the Caribbean. So there's the rough idea of the birds and the connectivity. The birds that are in more in the Yukon Delta area of Alaska that fly down on the west coast. Lee Tibbitts, who you'll be hearing from later, is really quite an expert on those birds, and anything I'm saying here does not include those birds. Okay, here's a stopover site, a night roost for these birds in the southeastern U.S. They go and they get gregarious in the evening and collect in large numbers, and that's really leading to some of our most significant monitoring efforts, where we've been monitoring them on the way north in these stopover sites, and particularly these mega roost areas. Just a list of some of the research and monitoring going on right now. We're working in the Northeast with juvenile Whimbrel migration and survival, something new and really a big hole in our understanding of what these birds are doing is juvenile survival. I mentioned the northbound mega roost monitoring down below. The monitoring section is below here. From these roosts, we've estimated about 56,000 birds in this particular population, and that's just based on our estimates, our counts, our roost counts, and estimates of how many birds are not using the roost count. So it's the margins of error here are going to be quite wide, but it's the best number we have right now for those birds. International Shorebird Survey has been very important as well for monitoring long term. I'll move right along here. These are actually tracks of birds for the last 2 years. These birds were tagged with the Ornatella tags that we have listed on the left, the 9-gram tags. In Texas in the Gulf, and then also up in Alaska in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge of Alaska. And this is representative of my cartoon contribution earlier. We've also been using long-term these solar 5-gram Argos tags, and we've had great success with them. They're just not as accurate as the pinpoint GPS Ornatella tags, but we've gained years of data from those since about 2010, tracking birds primarily out of Georgia and Virginia. Threats, nothing new to anybody on this call working with curlews or shorebirds anywhere. But again, we think the eastern population, the declines we've been seeing in the eastern population was since the 90s is about 50% in that mid-Atlantic group. We think that the big difference between this group and the ones on the West Coast, the Alaskan birds on the West Coast, is that many of these are hunted in South America and the Caribbean, in some of the islands in the Lesser Antilles. Hunting pressure is quite strong for them. We think that may be one significant area where we can do work, and there is actually a group working with the hunting, trying to alleviate hunting there. So some of the threats that we've determined with these birds. Here's a tag Whimbrel, just to let you know what one looks like with the antenna coming out of the back. This is when we tagged in Massachusetts, and this is on its second trip through Massachusetts a year later. This was an adult we tagged, and this is with one of those 5-gram transmitters. You see it fits nicely in their back, lower back, and is quite covered with feathers. Conservation, we've really ramped up our conservation efforts, and a conservation plan is in development right now that has lots of moving parts, as you can imagine. We are working with the U.S. Shorebird Conservation Partnership, which is really addressing hunting issues. The Whimbrel Working Group, which, if some of you are familiar with the Road to Recovery, we are framing the working group within the Road to Recovery methodology. And we have subcommittees now that are including science, conservation, application, and a steering committee. We do have coalitions for shorebird conservation that is taking into account building constituencies through something we call shorebird alliances, and we do have staff actually now working in Texas, Louisiana, in the Georgia Bight of Georgia and South Carolina, and Massachusetts, and actually in Brazil as well. So I'm probably over my time now, Mary, and I'm going to wrap up with that. So look forward to the discussions in a minute.
Excellent, thank you, Brad. I've got a couple of questions straight away before we move on. Is the population stable or is it still declining?
Yeah, I can't answer that actually right now. Yeah, Brian Watts has done most of that, and he has picked that up on the Atlantic coast. But it's the most recent analysis he conducted. The population was continuing to decline, and again, I think that's the East Coast, and we have seen that reflected, especially in the birds in New England, the numbers in New England. And I don't know if you've heard recently, though, a mega roost was found recently in South Carolina on DeVoe Bank in South Carolina, and my colleague Felicia Sanders has been working hard to protect that location. So last I was aware, the Mid-Atlantic population was still showing signs of decline.
There was I remember seeing a beautiful film that you made about that mega roost. Yeah. If when somebody else is presenting, if you could whack the link to it in the chat, that would be really lovely. It's well worth watching. It's very beautiful. They don't actually sound like our curlew, do they? They don't have a bubbly little fluty call, do they? Can you do an impression, Brad?
So they actually do. They do. They have a really nice fluty breeding call when they're on the breeding grounds, and also it's replicated, especially when the birds are coming in the evening to their evening roost. So it's a very nice, soft, twistly, and I won't embarrass myself, but to repeat it, but I will. I can try to find a link and send it to you as well. So yeah, no, it's a nice, beautiful call. Yeah. They have a harsher kind of a contact call when they're flying. But yeah, and I'm sure Camilo can attest all this too. We probably have very similar vocal patterns with the Icelandic birds.
And just the same question that I asked Richard, are they known and loved, do you think, in America?
Wow, no. I think that most shorebirds are not, and we're certainly working hard to draw attention to them and turning to print media when we can, and people get really excited about following these birds during migration, and so we have been trying to we do a pretty broad scale education and outreach campaign to get people to know them. But no, they disperse in the day when they're staging, and you can see one bird in a marsh somewhere in the Gulf, for instance, and have no idea that it is actually flying in and meeting 3,000 or 4,000 of its mates on a little island in the evening. So they're pretty hard to study. And we're trying to work with state agencies, particularly, to get them interested and tuned into the migration patterns of the birds.
Yeah, lovely. Well, good luck with that. Lovely, thank you. So we'll come on more about the pressures that you talked about in that presentation. They'll all come together, I think, at the end. But we'll go straight on now to well, I'm going to let the Australians and the Americans fight it out about who's got the longest bill. But I think the long bill curlew might have pipped at the post. I don't know. Jury's out, isn't it? But we'll have a long-billed curlew presentation from Jay Carlisle, who's director of research at the Intermountain Bird Observatory, which is part of Boise State University. So over to you, Jay. Tell us about the very beautiful and charismatic long-billed curlew.
Great. Well, thanks, Mary, for the invitation. I'm happy to be part of this crew and happy to be the representative for North America's long-billed curlew. It's a species I've been studying since 2009, At first, I thought it might just be a year or two, and now it's turned into a passion that I hope stays with me through the rest of my career. And over the next 6 or 7 minutes, I'm hoping to cover some aspects of the breeding range and habitats that are important to curlews there. And also same with the non-breeding range and some of the range of habitats that long-billed curlews use during that season. And I'll touch on the status of the species, threats, and potential conservation actions, and maybe a quick hint at some of the migratory tracking that a number of folks are doing and collaborating on. So I was saying this map that I'm showing is a screen grab from the eBird data site showing observations during a week during the peak of breeding season in mid to late May, to give a sense of the extent of the breeding range for long-billed curlews. There are some detections along the coast that are thought to be one-year-old birds that don't return to the breeding grounds. And so that's why I have this polygon. And the birds are breeding across most of what we know as the Great Plains, extending from southern Alberta and Saskatchewan in Canada down to New Mexico in the southern south central United States, and also a region called the Intermountain West of a lot of the western contiguous United States, intermontane valleys, and then extending all the way north into central British Columbia. And I think I saw my friend David Bradley with Birds Canada in the audience, and he and others have been studying this furthest north breeding population that's relatively new in terms of colonization over the last 30 or 40 years. When long-billed curlews are on the breeding grounds, they're using a range of habitats from relatively pristine grasslands like shown here in these two photos from Wyoming and Montana. And then they also use more heavily used habitats that could include grazing lands, either native or non-native grasslands that are used extensively for cattle and sheep grazing. But also, as I've shown in a few pictures across the top here, there are many agricultural areas where long-billed curlews are nesting in intensive agriculture. And so I have pictures here of nests in alfalfa on the upper left, wheat in the middle, and a single egg laid in a nest in a stubble field that was from corn from the prior year that hadn't yet been planted. And so they can use a number of grass and grass-like habitats throughout the breeding season. And then moving to the winter range or non-breeding range, because it really encompasses much more than the winter, roughly July to March, and it varies a bit based on age and sex of individuals. This range is a little bit more restricted in terms of having key areas in California, Mexico, and Texas, and a few other adjacent areas, with especially high concentrations in coastal areas, but also a few interior agricultural areas like the Central Valley of California and the Imperial and Mexicali Valley at the border between California and Mexico. And they use coastal intertidal habitats, as many curlews do, like this bird feeding on a crab in the coast of California. And then they also use a range of interior habitats from native and non-native grasslands and croplands, like this flock of curlews wintering in an agricultural area in the interior of Mexico. And long-billed curlews have lost a significant portion of their historic range. And so this map in the upper left shows the current distribution, or roughly the current distribution, in the solid colors, and then those lines that extend to the east or northeast, so the blue line for breeding and the tan or orange line extending up the Atlantic coast of the United States represent areas that formerly supported curlews and that no longer do, or at least not in large numbers anymore. And so just in terms of the status of the species, they are in better shape than many other curlews around the world, like we just heard about with Richard and the Far Eastern Curlew. I think long-billed curlews, though they have lost a significant portion of their range and they have suffered population declines and some habitat loss, there are still quite robust populations, both in breeding and non-breeding areas, that suggest there's plenty of hope for the species. And I think that they can do well with some level of human disturbance or use of the land, but to a point, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So they aren't listed, IUCN Red List or the United States Endangered Species Act or anything like that, but they are listed as a species of concern by a number of state and federal agencies. And some of the key threats that curlews face, and I'll just mention that I drew some of this from the Birds of the World species account by Duggar and Duggar, and some from my own experience with the species. So shooting and trapping, we've heard this in the two other presentations so far. It seems like a common theme. in the case of the long-billed curlew, there's sort of this bimodal effect here where we have the market hunting days of roughly a century ago, where many wading bird species were hunted regularly until that was made illegal many years ago. But in recent decades and years, we've seen more and more evidence for illegal shooting that actually isn't related to hunting and is actually just wasteful shooting of birds and leaving them on the ground. And so I have just some evidence of a recently shot long-billed curlew that we found in one of our study areas here. I'll just mention quickly that in one study area in public land that are protected areas, we lost 7 out of 17 birds with satellite transmitters to illegal shooting over a few years. So pretty high rate of illegal shooting of adult birds in an area where the adult population had declined by more than 80% over a 40-year period. And so how much the illegal shooting has played into that, we haven't teased out yet, but it certainly is an issue for curlews and other protected species that they share the environment with, including birds of prey and others. And other threats include agricultural chemicals, and I'll say it seems like there isn't as much known in the case of long-billed curlew in terms of how much this might affect the fitness of individual adults. There's a few pieces of evidence, but not a lot of systematic work that I'm aware of. But certainly thinking about prey abundance, if you have insecticides in agricultural fields, it's likely to reduce prey for the species. And then, like most species across the globe, the risk of habitat loss and degradation. With curlews, what I'm most aware of are the conversion of grassland habitats to agricultural habitats, or even converting grass-like crops, so things like alfalfa or wheat, to walnut groves or pecan or almond groves in the Central Valley of California, for example, that then represents a loss of wintering habitat. And then we've heard this in the prior 2 talks as well, the sensitivity to disturbance. I actually think long-billed curlews can be relatively resilient to forms of disturbance through much of the year, but I think during the nesting season, and also when you have these roosts, I don't know of any mega roosts quite to the level that we talked about with Whimbrels, but there are large roosts that folks are aware of in wintering areas that I think can be sensitive to disturbance, but also what if development happens in those areas? Does that then lead to a reduced carrying capacity for the surrounding area? So I think there's some open questions there that are worthy of investigation. And a PhD student of mine who just finished recently has documented reduced nesting success of curlews in association with higher levels of human recreation in some public lands. And so in terms of potential management actions, there are a number, and again, I'm drawing some from the Birds of the World species account that include grazing and fire. And I've kind of hinted at this a little bit, but curlews long-billed curlews, I should say, can readily use working lands, what we think of as working lands, so agricultural lands, grazing lands. And so grazing can be quite compatible in terms of both reducing the height of the grassland to make it more suitable for nesting. And there's a potential trampling risk, but from what I've seen in many published papers or master's or PhD theses, that tends to be relatively rare and probably not a large population threat. Fire can also reduce the height of the grass and make it more suitable. I want to mention delayed harvest. I think this is something that's likely used in other curlew species around the globe, but when curlews are nesting in working lands, if there can be either collaborating with landowners or maybe even having incentives for delaying harvest during a peak 4 or 5 week incubation window, that's something that I think could really increase nesting success. And that's been shown for many other species, wader or otherwise. And then in terms of especially wintering habitat, but also feeding habitat during the breeding season, we've noticed that flood irrigated agriculture is something that produces very productive foraging habitat and can mimic seasonal wetlands. And so when that's been used as a management tool, that definitely increases shorebird habitat, including for long-billed curlews. And then the act of habitat restoration or creation. So for instance, converting crops back to grassland, and curlews tend to respond pretty well to this. And I hinted at this on the range map, but an area up in central British Columbia that Birds Canada and others have worked on, there's actually a population that I think is fascinating, living amongst basically boreal and mixed conifer and deciduous forest, where clearings have been created for hay fields or pasture. And now in the last 30 or 40 years, curlews have continued to move north and found these newly opened areas and are at least in the years that I was able to visit and work with my friend David and others, doing reasonably well there. So that's kind of fascinating. Okay, winding down here. Oh, and this was just a couple of pictures of working on a farm here near Boise, Idaho, where I am, where the farmers were willing to mow around a nest to leave it intact. So obviously this is a high intensity management technique that would require a lot of coordination, but it is possible, and curlews will put up with this. I wanted to just acknowledge that though I'm representing long-billed curlews today, there are a load of great people and great researchers doing some great work on curlews. So here's a list of some of the topics that folks are working on, and some of the logos here showing a number of entities that I'm aware of. I'm sure there's a few others that are doing work on ecology, both breeding, wintering, and migratory connectivity. But also, I think importantly, working with private landowners on guidance that they can use to maintain successful ranching or grazing practices, but also maintaining habitat for long-billed curlews. And then just for fun to close, we'll click through 2 more slides. A number of folks listed here have been working together to track migratory connectivity of curlews. And this is just a single spring and fall migration that a colleague at the Smithsonian, Autumn Lynn Harrison, put together using data from their data set and birds that we were tracking from the Western United States. So this doesn't include some more recently tracked birds from British Columbia or other regions, but I thought it might be fun just to see what we've been able to piece together. And we have one paper in review at the moment, and we're hoping to be able to generate more now that we've tracked over 200 long-billed curlews over the last decade or so, and trying to bring as much out of that data as possible to lend towards conservation and management decisions. So with that, I really appreciate the opportunities and happy to be here.
Oh, fantastic. I love that animation today. It's just wonderful. 2 questions just before we go to we move on and a bigger discussion. One, why has hunting suddenly increased in the last few years? Any knowledge of that? Any ideas?
So the big issue we've seen in Idaho, and I don't know as much about surrounding states, is that there is very popular recreational shooting. So just shooting of targets. Sometimes those targets are live animals. So ground squirrels or prairie dogs or marmots are legally shot with a hunting license. And in some cases, there is not a bag limit. So there's not a limit on the number that you can shoot because they're designated by the state government as a non-protected species. And then what we see, and we've actually done a good amount of public education and outreach in schools and with community groups, even going to hunters education classes to discuss this. We have had people tell us about, being out target shooting, and then they happen to be out there during peak breeding season, and maybe a curlew nest has hatched nearby, and then you have some really aggressive adults trying to chase the intruders away and not leaving the folks that are target shooting alone, and then so they choose to shoot them instead of just moving down the road. I think some of it is, and I think it's a really small percentage of folks that are doing the recreational shooting, but there are so many that are going out there that even 0.5% of people that are willing to take a pot shot at something when they think nobody's looking. I think it happens more and more, and we've kind of realized that over the last couple of decades, just how prevalent it is with a number of species. So that's what we've seen in Idaho. We've also, there's a recent graduate student from our university who looked at this across power line structures across several Western states, mostly focused on birds of prey and ravens, and found that what we used to think of as a lot of electrocutions are actually mostly illegally shot birds, just happen to be sitting under power lines. And so even some nocturnal spotlighting of raptors has happened. It just seems like it's kind of an illegal recreational sport. And so that's where it's maybe even more frustrating, because it's not for consumption even, it's just because they're out there to see if they can do it. But again, I think the vast majority of folks are doing legal recreation, doing what they're allowed to do. And then you just have this small minority that are doing this, but it can have a big impact.
Amazing. And it's coming from the European point of view, where shooting curlews is almost non-existent. It's still legal in France, although there's a moratorium at the moment, and there's a small amount of illegal shooting, but not on the scale that we're hearing about from from everybody else that's spoken so far. So it's quite shocking to hear the pressure they're under from just shooting for the sake of it. And the question I'm asking everybody, are they known and loved, do you think, in America?
I think to a degree, yes. I think there's, okay, so I'm wearing a t-shirt with a long-billed curlew, and I've seen a lot of other people sporting t-shirts like
Can I
that.
have one?
And I think, I mentioned on the slide as far as what people are doing. American Bird Conservancy and partners have initiated a program almost a decade ago that is working with private landowners in the Northern Great Plains to try to, enhance conservation practices, enhance the sustainability of their ranches, but also make sure that they can make some tweaks to make sure that long-billed curlews have a better chance of breeding successfully. And talking to private landowners, it's a species that you can easily have a conversation over coffee about, whereas something like a grizzly bear or a wolverine or a wolf that's a little bit more controversial, you can't really get in the door with a conversation about those. But a long-billed curlew is one that most private landowners recognize because they're large and vocal, and they know a lot about their life history. When you start talking to a rancher, they can tell you a lot of things, and just by a conversation you can be like, okay, they're probably nesting over there, etc. And so they know a lot about them, and so I think it makes it easy for them to then kind of get on board in terms of thinking about their conservation.
Oh, fascinating. And they're an all-American species as well, aren't they? Because they don't actually leave; they stay within North America. So they're the sort of
Yep.
true American.
True. Yeah, they're
And
a bit of a shorter distance migrant than some of the other ones.
They are. And I have to ask, who's got the longest bill? Is it the Far Eastern or is it the long-billed?
I'm trying to think. I think the longest beak that we've measured on a female was something like 205 millimeters, is that right? So 20.5 centimeters. So I can't remember how that ranked.
Richard?
Oh, it's got to be close. It's going to be really close. I don't know about the extremes. We'll have to collect some data and correspond with each other.
Because they're both astonishing to look at, aren't they? With these enormous bills. It's fabulous to see them. Okay,
That's
thank
right.
you. So the next,
as you say, Jay, some of those females, just ridiculously long bills. It's just the amount of variation in bill length is incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll
amazing.
say, just having captured birds in various parts of the breeding grounds, it's amazing. Portions like New Mexico and other areas have especially large beaks, and then other portions like Idaho and British Columbia have much shorter beaks, to where you might have a female in a British Columbia or Idaho population that might have as long a bill as a male in a New Mexico population. So fascinating.
Great stuff. And did they say Eurasian Curlew, Jay? I'm asking everybody about the sounds. I was hoping I'd hear more Curlew sounds, because the call is...
I have to admit, I've only seen the Eurasian a couple times, and I can't remember the sound. I mean, I think long-billed curlews have a beautiful sound, the flight display and, fluty, like people have talked about, kind of a wolf whistle.
Okay. All the I made a few on the Curlews of the world a few years ago, where they're all on. Megan will put the link. If you listen to this, I put the sounds all the way through those as well, because the defining characteristics of curlews, apart from their lovely long bills, is the calls they make, and they're all actually quite not very different, but they're all slightly different, and they're all incredibly beautiful. I always think of the long-billed curlew as quite ethereal, lovely sound. So the next North American species that I want to talk about, unfortunately, the speaker we had lined up had a hospital appointment that came up, and so it was a person from Hawaii who was going to tell us about Bristle-thighed Curlew. Podcast on Bristle-thighed Curlews, and I just cut that down a bit and put some pictures over it to give everybody a chance, because we can't do Curlews of the world without hearing about the absolutely wonderful Bristle-thighed Curlew. The very first thing was I asked Lee Tibbitts about why they're called Bristle-thighed, and said it's one of those names that literally just makes you smile every time you hear it.
I know, it is funny, but they do have bristles on their thighs, and they are just the shafts of feathers. That's what they are. So it's a regular feather, but it hasn't developed all the little barbs off of it. It's just a shaft with a few barbs. But often, if you look closely and if the light reflects off them, they kind of shimmer on their upper thigh. Always ask people what they think. Why do you think they have bristles? And we don't really know.
Where do they live? Give me their geographical range.
Okay, they're a very interesting bird because they only breed in Alaska and in two areas of Alaska. They breed on the Seward Peninsula, which is northwest Alaska, and then down in the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, which is kind of southwest also. And these two breeding areas are very small, and they're separated by about 300 kilometers. So the birds breed there, and then when they migrate, they only go to the Central Pacific, and they spend the non-breeding season on the islands and atolls in the Central Pacific Oceans.
How far is that distance that they fly then?
The closest islands that they can land on are the Hawaiian Islands, and those are about 5,000 kilometers from Alaska. And then if they go farther south, which most of the population does, they can go a total of 6,000 to 9,000 kilometers. They do make these flights in one nonstop flight.
One nonstop flight. That's incredible.
Yes.
And so if they come across bad weather or something like that, there's nowhere for them to land.
If they hit bad weather, they'll just take a longer time, and they usually have enough reserves to make that work.
How many Bristle-thighed Curlews are there in the world, Lee?
We think there's about 10,000 individuals, and about 7,000 of those birds are breeding birds. Curlews don't breed until they're at least 3 years old. So once they leave Alaska, they get down to their non-breeding areas, and they stay there for 3 years before they come back north to breed.
Not many then in the world. They're very small population.
They are a small population, and that's kind of why they're designated as a species of conservation concern. And it's because that means they're not that resilient. If something happens to even a small proportion of them, then that's a problem. But the thing that the Bristle-thighed Curlews have going for them is that they do breed in these very remote areas, so they don't have a lot of the threats that other curlews do who breed around agriculture or around people.
What do they eat?
They eat pretty much everything. They're really cosmopolitan that way. Up in Alaska, when they get to the breeding grounds in the spring, like in May, they'll come up here. Their breeding area is often covered with mostly snow, but there's a lot of spiders running on top of the snow, and there's a lot of overwintered berries. When they go farther south on the atolls and the islands down in the Pacific, they eat a lot of invertebrates, like a lot of insects, but also a lot of crabs, hermit crabs too. They're pretty generalist in their feeding habits.
And do they have the beautiful haunting calls that we're used to hearing over here in Europe with the Eurasian curlew?
They do have a lot of really interesting calls, and the songs they have that you hear in the breeding grounds can go on and on, and they bobble and they wobble and they wail a little bit, and it's a really interesting song. When they're not breeding, they have a very distinct, like a chiowit call, they say. It sounds like a person actually whistling at you. So
I heard that they molt and therefore become flightless, which is really unusual for a curlew.
It is, and that's a result of their wintering habitat or their non-breeding area, because their traditional areas had no mammals and no predators, really. So the birds could molt all their feathers without any consequences. And so if you go down there to some like these very remote atolls, you will find curlews in like November, December that cannot fly.
It would be a disaster then if any land predators, rats or cats or whatever, actually got onto these islands, wouldn't it?
It would be, and it has happened. I mean, we know that has happened, that, curlews have been extirpated from a lot of the high islands, we call them, like the main Hawaiian Islands and the larger islands with people on them and dogs and cats, for sure. Yeah. So I will mention that on the non-breeding grounds down in Oceania, there is a big effort these days to get rid of predators from islands, so hopefully that will benefit the curlews. The effort's usually aimed at breeding seabirds, to let the seabirds breed, and hopefully the curlews will benefit from that. And also, one of our concerns is, of course, sea level rise, because a lot of the atolls the curlews spend the winter on are very low islands that are going to be covered up probably in the next 50 years or so, unless things change. And so one of the studies we look at is how resilient the curlews are, how much they can move within their non-breeding grounds.
the Bristle-thighed Curlew has a really different song to any of the others. It's really a beautiful sound, but not bubbly like we're used to. So again, the link to the full podcast will be in the chat, and you go to our website and listen to the interview with Lee. It's slightly longer than that cut down version, and you'll hear the calls of the Bristle-thighed Curlew in there. But again, we're having the same kind of themes coming up about the Bristle-thighed, habitat loss, pressure from predation. And it's the first time I've heard anybody talk about predation, actually, the predation pressure on Bristle-thighed Curlews and how they've actually been eradicated from areas where there are a lot of people. So that was the Bristle-thighed, a very small population of them, as we heard, but very specific and very specialized, as it just goes between Alaska and Hawaii and then molts when it gets, or to the Pacific Islands, and molts when it gets there. Quite a strange sort of outlier of the Curlew world, but absolutely magnificent. The next one we're going to go again to a small one, and I must say that the Bristle-thighed Curlew is a bit more Whimbrel-like than the Curlew, the long-billed or the Eurasian or the Far Eastern. It looks more like a Whimbrel with its heavy face markings. The Bristle-thighed is very cinnamon coloured and has a very cinnamon rump when it flies. So that's what's very distinguishing about it. But we're going to hear about the Whimbrel that we're much more used to in Europe, because Europe particularly, well, certainly that's where I've ever seen them. Whimbrels that nest up in Iceland. And we've got Camilo, Carneiro, sorry, Camilo, if that, to tell us about the Whimbrels from Iceland. Thanks very much.
Thank you. As Mary said, my name is Camilo. I'm postdoc at the South Iceland Research Center. And I would like to start by thanking Curlew Action for organizing this webinar and inviting me to speak about the Icelandic Whimbrel. I must say that my research has been focused mainly on their migration ecology and more recently on the development of their chicks. So during this talk, I will be mostly sharing research conducted by colleagues in our research group. Just to give an overview of where Whimbrels are in the world, and these include the Whimbrels that Brad mentioned earlier, they are mostly found breeding in the subarctic, and then they spend the winter along the coasts of temperate and tropical regions. They're not easy to count, and the world population is estimated between 1 and 2.3 million individuals. The IUCN has placed them in the least concerned conservation category, even though they show a declining population trend. The Icelandic subspecies uses just a bit of the globe, and they can be found mainly along the East Atlantic Flyway between Iceland and West Africa. In Iceland, the population is estimated to be 256,000 pairs, so that's just over 500,000 of birds nesting in Iceland. And this means that Iceland is responsible for 22 to 51% of the global population of Whimbrels. Of course, Iceland is not the only country responsible, because they are long-distance migrants and therefore rely on other places around the globe, or along this flyway at least. They arrive in Iceland in late April, early May. They start nesting within a few weeks, and if everything goes well, they will lay four eggs. Four chicks will hatch, and they will raise those 4 chicks. And then they will leave the country around August. In Iceland, they like to breed in low altitude places with a varying amount of vegetation cover, but this vegetation is always short, as you can see in the image, and comprised by a mixture of mosses, short grasses, and very low shrubs. They like very much river plains and heathland habitats, and these areas are usually very lightly grazed by sheep. Given what they like, it's not surprising that they are found mainly on the lowlands of the country, and particularly the southern lowlands are very important. It's a very extensive region with a lot of Whimbrels. There are no countrywide counts that we can use to draw a population trend as a whole, but there are regional counts. And particularly in the southern lowlands, since 2011, Thomas Gunnarsson has been out every summer going to the same 63 points and counting Whimbrels. And the recent analysis of those data showed us a warning trend of an annual decline of about 3% per year. This change in Whimbrel numbers occurs in parallel to a change in the landscape. And you can see in this photo immediately a slice of land that used to be nice heathland, like you see in the foreground, and has been converted into a hayfield. You see a plantation of trees in the background, and you see a few summer cottages. These are the three threats that I will talk a bit about, but there are way more that we can discuss afterwards. So starting with agriculture, I must say that Iceland still has a lot, agriculture is still of low intensity. If your mindset is in other European countries, only about 7% of the land in the lowlands is cultivated. And this means that the landscape is a mosaic of hayfields, which we could call intensive management, surrounded by moderate management places, which are rarely mown fields and used for grazing, and also some semi-natural or natural areas with very low or no grazing at all. A few years ago, one colleague of mine, Lilia Johannesdottir, she went out and counted Whimbrels, and other waders, in these three main habitat types. She did this in the south, in the southern lowlands, and she found a clear pattern of fewer Whimbrels in high intensity, in intensive management places compared to moderate and light management. But she did the same in other regions of the country, and she found a more or less consistent pattern, indicating that intensification likely leads to a lower number of Whimbrels. But Lilia did more, and she talked to the farmers around the country and asked them whether they plan to expand their cultivated areas. And she found that 63% of them do indeed intend to increase their area of cultivated land. So if we want to do something about Whimbrel numbers, this is something to keep in mind. I mentioned the plantations of forests in Iceland. Iceland has been treeless in the recent centuries, but in the recent years, there has been an increase in tree plantations, and that's with the main goal of binding carbon. Unfortunately, this happens mostly in the vegetated lowlands, so habitats for Whimbrels and other open habitat waders, and it's expected to increase in the upcoming years. Another colleague was interested in the effect of these plantations. It is obvious that taking a piece of land, planting trees, and not having open habitat takes that from open habitat breeders like Whimbrels. But Aldis Pálsdóttir, she was also interested in if there is an edge effect around these tree plantations. So what she did was walking transects away from the forest edges into the surrounding open habitat and continuously counting the birds. And she found a clear pattern of an increasing number of Whimbrels the further away she was from the forest. So there is a clear hedge effect of these tree plantations that take the land where the trees are, but also a bit of the land around. Aldis, she was also interested in a possible effect of summer cottages. For you to have an idea of landscape changes in Iceland, you can see here an aerial image from 1998, and you can see how it changes over 20 years. I think the change is clear, and I cannot tell you stats from these 20 years, but I can tell you that from 2005 to 2022, there was an increase of from 10,000 to 15,000 summer cottages. There are way more planned, and again, this happens mostly in the lowlands. What Aldis did in this case was counting birds and Whimbrels here in places without any cottages, places with just one cottage, with a few, and with a high number of cottages. And once again, she found a clear pattern where places without cottages definitely had more Whimbrels than places with just a single or more cottages. These threats that I mentioned and others, they are clearly a decision of how humans use the land. So I think it's important to also bring up and share with you how the human population in Iceland is doing. And as you can see, it has been increasing for a long time, and particularly in recent years, it has increased a lot. With an increasing human population, we can expect that there will be an increasing demand for infrastructure, for housing, for food, etc. So we could expect that there will be a further loss of the lowlands in the upcoming years, but I think that might only happen if we don't make any effort to prevent it. And that's it from me. I would like to thank everyone who joined for this webinar, say that I'm open to discuss any of these, and that I will share in the chat box a list of links to research that I shared here and other that you might be interested to browse through. And more importantly, a link to the Weather Tales blog, which is amazing work by Graham Appleton, who takes our research from Iceland and summarizes it in a very friendly way. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That's we'll think of Iceland as being so sort of remote, in a way, down here, but you have so many pressures on the birds just in that one place. Really interesting. Thank you. And you're right, Graham Appleton's Wader Tale blog is fabulous. Really interesting resource. I really do recommend anybody interested in shorebirds at all, anyway, gets covered really in a really way. So thank you for that. Just before we go on, your scientific research, because I know conservation is like a side, something that you know about, but you gave a very interesting talk at the International Wader Study Group on the effect of handling Whimbrel. Just a few sentences, summarize what you found, because that was fun.
Yes. So in just a bit of context, in the recent years, I was quite focused on how the chicks grow and so on. And that means catching and handling the chicks very often. Of course, we start wondering, are we actually having any detrimental effect? And are we basically affecting the data we are collecting? I mean, there's two ways. There is the welfare of the birds, and then we end up with knowledge which is incorrect. And well, as it happens, and anyone who does fieldwork knows, things don't go as planned. So I can plan, okay, I will catch chicks every 3 days, and end up catching some chicks every 3 days, some chicks every 6 days, some chicks every 9 days. So using this data, I thought, okay, it's possible to actually assess if there is any effect of handling these chicks very often or not. Well, and yeah, long story short, yeah, there isn't an effect, at least in this case. So at least our current protocol doesn't seem to have any influence on the chick's body condition. So we can continue doing what we are doing. So far, it's safe. But yeah, this is very important to note that I think we are working in still a more or less special environment where there are loads of Whimbrels, as you heard, in some habitats that are still quite good, I would say. So in other contexts might be different. And well, I think the context in Iceland might also become different.
Thanks. I think that's a really important piece of work, because a lot of the conservation measures that people are putting in place right around the world are quite hands-on, and it's very good to have that research that shows, at least your research that you've shown in Iceland, that there doesn't seem an effect on the birds by handling them sometimes. So that's quite useful to know. Thanks for that. Mike, but I'm going to have to ask you as well, are Whimbrels loved in Iceland?
I think they are, actually. I think, well, there isn't much of a bird diversity in Iceland, and I think people are, so it's easier for people to recognize the species. And I think Icelanders, I think they are still well connected to wildlife, which then what happens is a bit, at least for me, feels a bit contradictory. But I think people do know and do love Whimbrels. I think the problem is that that's not enough, and there are a lot of Whimbrels and a lot of space, or at least you perceive it as like that. So even if you love them, you might think that taking a bit of land for your summer cottage is fine, because yeah, maybe you take the land from one pair of Whimbrel, but there are plenty more. well, but over time there will be a problem.
Death by 1,000 cuts. Thank you. That's really interesting. Mike, you seem to have frozen, or you've been in one locked position for a very long time. Can you hear us? Muted as well at the moment. You might need to go out and come again.
No, I can hear you fine.
All right. Oh, you're just your picture's frozen for me anyway.
Oh.
Megan, do you want to operate Mike's presentation on anyone who doesn't know much about the Eurasian curlew? If you join our regular webinars, then hopefully you will know a bit more about them. But if you don't, Mike will give an overview of the Eurasian curlew so that we have a comparison around the world. Thanks, Mike. Mike, by the way, is a trustee of Curlew Action, a lifelong birder field worker with birds, and over the last quite a number of years has been really concentrating on looking after the curlew in the lowlands of England, especially around Gloucestershire. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Mary, and it's really a great privilege to talk among such a international stellar cast. As you've said, we've had quite a lot of webinars on Eurasian curlew, so I'm going to skip fairly rapidly through it using some slides which Mary and I have used at various places. This is the beast we're talking about. We'd like to try and play its call. Can you try, Megan? Listening to the presentations this evening, it seems to me that the Eurasian curlew must be the most numerous of all our curlews worldwide, and it has a huge range going way beyond what that picture shows you, because most of the work has been done in Northern and Western Europe. And the thought that's been going through my head in listening to these presentations is that it's a thought I've had for some time now. There's a great big hole in our knowledge on what goes on in Eastern Europe and Northern Asia. Those breeding, those spots of breeding points don't indicate well enough just how many curlews must be breeding out there and how little we know about them and how few contacts we have with scientists working in that area. And then I've spent a lot of time around the Mediterranean, particularly in North Africa, and there are large numbers of curlews wintering down there. So I think my big message is going to be we really need to know a huge amount more about what's happening in Eastern Europe and Northern Central Asia, and a lot more about those wintering grounds in Africa. As you'll see, those blue lines on there show large numbers of curlews nesting in Northern and Central Europe. A very large proportion of them come to the British Isles. Something like 25% of the world population winters in the British Isles. And Britain also has something like 25% of the breeding population. So the UK, United Kingdom, is really important. We're talking in Britain of 120,000 roughly breeding birds. And we think it's dropping by 5,000 a year. And a quite famous paper nearly 10 years ago now suggested that the Eurasian curlew is the biggest bird priority in Britain because of the large numbers which winter here. And that shows the results of the intensive reviews that are done of breeding and wintering birds in Britain. Curlews in Britain are upland nesting birds mainly, and if you look at below that black line, they used to breed much more widely in southern Britain, and but and in Ireland and in Wales, but in Ireland, Wales, and in the lowlands of southern Britain, numbers have decreased very considerably. So the reasons for this decline, above all, this is not just in Britain, but across Western Europe, I would say. And I think you have to look at the importance of the European Union for bringing together data and conservation measures right across Western Europe. But the big reason is poor productivity of chicks. Eurasian curlews do not produce many chicks. They're not very good parents. They may need a leg up. And this comes about partly from loss of habitat, especially the lowland grasslands, which has also been mentioned in America. And that comes through changes, essentially intensification of agriculture, heavy predation in much of Europe, and something which nobody has mentioned, which may well prove to be important, climate change. A long time ago, the British Trust for Ornithology said that curlew was one of the species most likely to be affected by climate change and to move north as climate change intensifies. We need more breeding success. There's a curlew nest hatching, and there's a half-grown young curlew in grasslands, and we find in our local projects in southern lowland England that there is really poor hatching, and then poor fledging from the few that hatch. Here are some of the main predators. Foxes and badgers are heavy predators of nests on the ground. You see a carrion crow in at the bottom middle there. Curlews can probably help themselves against a carrion crow, but their bigger cousins, the ravens, have become much more prevalent, and a curlew just cannot hold its own against ravens. Bottom right is a buzzard. There's been a huge reintroduction program of red kites, and red kites are birds which scavenge over hayfields, and the big reintroduction program has caused lots of happiness among nature lovers, but it's yet another predator, and it's a protected species, so you can't control badgers, you can't control red kites, and you can't control ravens, which makes life that much more difficult for curlews. So, conclusions. A lot of effort has gone into curlew conservation, I would say, in Western Europe and in Northern Europe. These conservation efforts, though, have got to carry on, as we've seen this evening, not only in UK, but at international level. And it's really important to have this public awareness of the value of curlews. I'm always amused when you see a television film that if anybody wants to give an impression of wildness, remoteness, and strangeness, there's nearly always a curlew call in the distance. This comes up in romantic things where the lovers disappeared into the distance with a curlew call above them. And what it needs above all is financial support from private and public sources. Thank you for listening. I hope that's given a summary. Let's get back to general conclusions.
Thank you ever so much, Mike. That was a rapid canter through Eurasian curlew conservation. Wow, I mean, talk about curlews of the world. How on earth do you start to gather all this together for a discussion? But I'd very much like to just see some of the common threads and see what speakers thought of each other's presentations, or is anything new in there that struck you, and also to get a sense of what is it that curlew are telling us about the state of the planet that we've got at the moment. So I'm going to start off with those wonderful maps that many people showed, which show the migrations of the birds, their flights, whether they're just short migrants or long distance migrants. Curlews are weaving a web of flight and joy around the world, if you like. It's like a lacework of curlew flight around the world. And they can't help but come in touch with us. You know, curlews, by their very nature, by the way they live, they will at some point in their life cycle come across us and what we do. And so we are intricately bound together, ourselves and curlews, and we hold the future of these birds in our hands, really. But I want to start with the Far Eastern Curlew, Richard, because as the most endangered and probably one of the most long distance as well, does that make it really difficult to? They don't belong to any particular country, do they? Nobody seems to think that's my curlew, I'm going to look after it. Do these big long distances make it harder to look after something like the long-bill curlew, Far Eastern Curlew?
Yes, I think they do. We surprised a number of Australians in our tracking study that showed that Far Eastern Curlew spend 56% of their lives in Australia, which kind of surprised many people, and does raise that question around whose birds are they? Obviously they're shared birds, but I think it's important to try to articulate how much they depend on each of the places that they visit, right? I mean, as we all know, with these migratory birds, if one of their stepping stones in their journey is damaged or degraded, that affects the entire population. So it's generating that sense of shared responsibility, of course, that's really important. And there are a number of international migratory bird agreements. One of the big problems in our flyway over here is that the Convention on Migratory Species is not signed by many of the countries in the East Asian, Australasian flyway. That means there are many gaps in terms of formal international agreements. And in place of that, there's been a very strong push for more informal arrangements and voluntary agreements among countries. And I have to say, I think that's beginning to work quite well. There's been a single species international action plan for the Eastern Curlew, which was led by the Philippines and Australia. And many countries around the flyway signed on to that informal kind of initiative. So, I think cooperation is critically important for these migratory birds. And it's really good to see those mechanisms emerging here in our flyway.
With the specifically with the Far Eastern, the difference in the cultures that the bird flies through is just enormous. From Australia, as you talked about, the very strong hunting traditions in Russia, yep, to the rapid development of China. There's such different mindsets, different cultures, different approaches to wildlife. Does that make it even more challenging?
That's actually a really interesting point you raised. That Australians love driving their four-wheel drives on beaches, and that translates into threats to the birds, as you say. And I think that's a really important dimension to this. We each bring our own kinds of interactions to the birds that arise from cultures of different places. And in part, that's a celebration, right? The different ways in which different cultures welcome the birds on their migrations and so on, but also the different ways in which cultural variations impact the kinds of threats that we see. And it also means that conservation solutions cannot be imposed from the outside. They need to be generated from within cultures and from within countries. And I think that's a really heartening development in our flyway over the last 15 years. Has been a real rise in people who really know about conservation. They know the science. They can develop solutions, and that's happening within countries across the flyway now, rather than a kind of imposition from the outside, which has been great to see.
Yeah, excellent. Mike, you've got something to say about that?
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned the Convention on Migratory Species. I'd also like to remind you of the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, where I worked for many years in the Secretariat there. And it was very striking to us there that conditions are very different right across the northern and the whole Arctic breeding areas of many of these curlews. These are icebound in winter, and so the only time when there are any birds of any species about up there is in the summer, and therefore they feel that they have they are the only time they can really hunt is in the spring and summer, which is the breeding period, and therefore it's really very difficult to go to them and say you shouldn't be hunting these birds there, and at that time, because that's their breeding period, because it's the only time when they're there. There's a completely different mindset, and I think that's why I was talking about the gap in our knowledge in central and northern Russia, and I'm sure it goes right across to China as well. We have to appreciate there's a different mindset, and it will be very difficult to persuade people there that they shouldn't be shooting curlews on the breeding ground.
Yes, thanks, Mike. The speakers, if you want to either put your yellow hand up or just sort of wave at me or something, if you want to contribute to the conversation, that would be great. Has anybody else got anything to contribute to that with the problems of having birds that fly long distances? Probably the least of problem for you, Jay, is it, with the long-billed curlew, because your birds just sort of flit from the coast back into the inland again?
Right, and I've heard several colleagues and friends think about songbird or long-billed curlews as an honorary land bird in their behavior because they are not as restricted to specific wetland patches for stopover. I mean, there are, especially in the winter, they have very high site fidelity, especially to coastal wintering locations. But in terms of their stopover and migration, especially using interior habitats, grassland, crops, there's a lot of that available in each direction. And so you don't have that bottleneck like the Far Eastern Curlew in the Yellow Sea, for example, or some of these other species that are much more restricted during that stopover period. So I think I worry about long-billed curlews less during stopover or migration. There are other issues. They are lost to falcons during migration. There's other things that happen, but as far as like 80% of the impact happening during a short period, I think long-billed curlews are free of that, partly because they're a little bit more generalist, but like you said, the shorter distance of migration and less restricted in their routes.
Yeah. You mentioned predation there, and one thing that surprised me was how little people talked about predation as a major issue affecting their different curlew species. That's definitely not something I would say when any conversation we have about the Eurasian curlew, where predation comes right at the top of the top three major threats and could even be, shared number one with habitat loss. So Mike gave us a brief introduction there onto the major threats, both ground predators and aerial predators of the Eurasian curlew. Camilo, can I ask you about the Whimbrels that you work on? How is the predation pressure in Iceland that you know of?
I don't think it's very high. If you're talking about conservation and things that, if we will need to rank actions to halt the declining trend we are observing, then I wouldn't put predation very high on the list. Their main predator might be the Arctic fox, followed by ravens, and in some places, well, they actually nest with Arctic skuas, which also take some of their eggs and some of the chicks. But I don't think across the landscape that's a big issue. I think that becomes an issue when the population is already a bit small.
Mm-hmm. Richard, do you know how much predation is an issue for the Far Eastern Curlew, other than human predators with their guns?
It's a very good question, and it's actually topical. There's feral red foxes are a big problem in Australia, and there is actually a really big information gap. There's actually been no studies of feral animal predation on eastern curlews, and it is entirely possible it's a real significant threat. And And if you like, the good thing about it is that it can be managed. Actually, if we know it's happening, we know how to do fox baiting. It's expensive, but we do know how to do it. But it's targeted to areas where it's kind of known to be an issue. So it's a really important gap in our knowledge for Far Eastern Curlew. And of course, on the breeding grounds, there's very little information about predation. And, you know, Mike mentioned climate change earlier, and I think that's an important factor in Arctic and subarctic breeding areas where the distributions of predators are changing as a result of climate change, and perhaps bringing new predators into contact with the breeding zones of some of these species. So there's a lot to learn about predation, but at the moment, there's really no data for Far Eastern Curlew.
What we find with the Eurasian curlew in the very intensive farmed habitats that we have now across most of Europe, we have high numbers of predators. There seems to be a correlation between intensity of farming and the numbers of generalist predators like foxes and crows and so on. So it might be that you're still lucky enough to have large areas that are not so intensively managed, and therefore there's more of a balance. Maybe that's what's going on in many places, do you think?
Yeah, and I think Far Eastern Curlews, to be honest, they're very sensitive to habitat change. We don't really see any of them breeding in farmland. It just doesn't seem to be a thing. So, you know, I'm not sure in that sense whether predation is a significant overlay, you know, in more disturbed landscapes. That said, I think, you know, in the non-breeding areas, absolutely. So it's honestly a real tough one. We really don't know enough about predation.
Yeah, fascinating. And Jay?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of details from other researchers, but from our work that I'm familiar with in Idaho and in Montana and Wyoming during the breeding season, we see ravens and badgers as two key predators, and we definitely have seen an increase in nest failure in one of our southwestern Idaho population. That I think my working hypothesis is that the increase in human recreation, the increase in ground squirrel carcasses on the landscape, and human infrastructure like power lines or structures around increases the number of ravens that are just using the area generally, which then means there's a higher chance of nest failure. And then this is all preliminary, but I hinted at it with our satellite tracking data or cellular tracking data. We have lost so illegal shooting has been the #1 single source of mortality, especially for the Idaho population that we've studied. But the other thing that's sort of risen up there is known falcon predation during migration, where we've lost birds to peregrine or prairie falcons, and actually tracked a few of these birds back to eyries. We actually helped Nevada find a new peregrine falcon nest because one of our curlew transmitters was then delivered to that mountainside, and it led the biologist to find the transmitter for me, but find a peregrine nest in exchange. And so I know that's a risk, but my sense is that, again, it's probably background level and not necessarily something that we need to worry about as much. I think in those more human modified areas, or where you have this boost in raven numbers, that maybe leads to an imbalance.
Sure, because I mean, predation is natural, and so they will always have been predated and coped with natural predators like birds of prey and so on. So, but it's when everything gets out of kilter that we start to get the big problems that we're seeing, I think, in Europe. Mike, you have another question?
I wanted to ask the other participants about the cultural background of curlews in their areas. I mentioned it a little bit, and Mary, you in your books have spoken a great deal about that. Do your local curlews have the sort of cultural aura about them that curlews do throughout Western Europe? It's not only in the British Isles and Ireland, but right across in France, Germany, Scandinavia. Curlews have a place in folklore. Does that happen with you?
Who'd like to go first? How about you? Is that something you've come across, Camilo, in Iceland?
Well, I must say I don't know Icelandic, so I couldn't read much of the local literature. Well, but I know they are mentioned, and there are some poems and sayings about Whimbrels bringing spring and so on. So they definitely are mentioned and have a place. I don't know how big that place is.
Yeah. And Jay, I know that there's indigenous folk tales about how the curlew got a long bill. It got it trapped under a rock apparently, and something tried to pull the curlew out, and it stretched its bill. There's some delightful stories like that.
And I have to admit, I'm not familiar with the folklore, so I can't bring a lot to this question other than knowing that they're well liked in the areas that I've worked at, a lot of the private landowners.
Yeah.
But as far as traditional cultures, I'm not as aware, but I'm not surprised just given how vocal and conspicuous they are.
Yeah, yeah. Anything from you, Richard, up in Australia?
Yeah, certainly Indigenous Australians, particularly living in the Gulf of Carpentaria, right, which is the giant gulf on the north coast of Australia, have a really strong connection with migratory shorebirds in general, marking the passage of seasons and so on. But Far Eastern Curlew in particular, I think for many of the reasons people have already talked about, just the timing of arrival, the kind of amazing calls. And the fact they're so large makes them possible to kind of engage and see them and know them in a way that's quite difficult for many of the smaller migratory shorebirds. And many Indigenous rangers across northern Australia are extremely heavily involved in building monitoring and research programs in that part of the country, which is absolutely fantastic. Because the whole region of northern Australia historically has been much less well understood from a scientific kind of Western scientific viewpoint. So it's really great to see cultures collaborating in northern Australia to understand Far Eastern Curlew.
Thank you. One of the things, again, that surprised me is that something that here in Europe we don't talk about that much so far in relation to curlews, although it's beginning to be talked about more. But 2 or 3 people have mentioned it in their presentations, including the presentation from Lee, the little film with Lee Tibbitts, is the increasing effect of climate change in terms of we see it with lots and lots of rain in the spring and potential flooding of breeding areas. Maybe increase in temperatures because they're quite cold loving birds and forcing them more northwards. And then tangentially from that, or as a consequence of all that, the desire to plant a lot more trees to ameliorate the effects of climate change. And very often those trees are planted on breeding grounds because they tend to be on unproductive land, which isn't really used for farming. And so there's a double whammy, if you like, with climate change that's beginning to be quite obvious in Europe. And I'd be very interested to know how that's playing out in other parts of the world. And certainly I know, Camilo, in your presentation, you talked about the increase in forestry. Is that a purely commercial thing, or is that a climate mitigation push as well?
I think the main current argument for tree plantations is to bind carbon. I think that's the main reason waived. But related to climate change, I would like to mention the shrubification that can also become a big problem. As I mentioned for Whimbrel, well, and all the other species that breed in the same areas, they tend to use areas which are lightly grazed by sheep. This has been happening for many years in Iceland, that the sheep roam more or less free and keep the vegetation at a very good level for waders. But in recent decades, the population of sheep has, well, I think since 85 it has halved. So there isn't much, but there is some research in Iceland that shows that fields have been, well, I've even seen that, although I didn't collect data, that some good areas, well, we just see the shrubs every year growing and growing and growing, and soon there won't be any birds left in those areas. And of course, that's something that if you don't do anything to the land, or allow any sheep to the land. It might seem like a good idea, but for these open estuaries, it won't be a good idea, and it can have this effect in a huge area without anything happening. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yes,
and of
absolutely.
course, I mean, warming climate will facilitate this.
Yeah. How is climate change panning out in North America in terms of the long-billed curlew?
Well, the thing I went to right away is just thinking about in the reproductive monitoring that we've done at several sites across the Intermountain West, we've seen some pretty dramatic differences year to year in nesting success that have related to either an extreme drought year that happened here in southwestern Idaho a few years ago, where we had close to 3 or 4% hatching success relative to more like 30% on average over recent years, which was already lower than a historical study 40 years ago. And then also actually flooding events in the spring in some of the wetter habitats in more montane pasture habitats that are already wet or might even be flood irrigated for ranching. And so the curlews are kind of used to it. But then if it was an already wet year with a big snowfall, and then that could inundate nests at the exact wrong time. And so we have seen that in a couple of study sites that are otherwise quite productive. But then when that happens, it knocks them back. And so my sense is that those are relatively rare events now, but if they could become more common with a climate future that brings more erratic or stormy weather or more extremes in terms of higher precipitation or lower precipitation, then you could have forces acting on reproductive success or even productivity of other habitats that might become more apparent in the coming decades.
Absolutely. And Richard?
Yes, I think the Far Eastern Curlew is a relatively southerly breeder compared to most of our migratory shorebirds in this flyway. It doesn't really go north of the massive boreal forest belt. So it's exposed to less climate change than is happening in the Arctic, the fully Arctic regions. That said, I think there's important, people have mentioned shrubification, and that's an important issue, I think, for these grassland habitats that these birds are now sandwiched in between the big rice paddies of China and the boreal forest as you move further north in the Russian Far East. So again, it would be interesting, I think, some analyses to do to try to understand what that threat looks like, at least from the view of all migratory shorebirds. I think the Far Eastern Curlew is less threatened by climate change than others. But the other issue is sea level rise, further pressuring mudflats in the Yellow Sea, where the sea level is predicted to rise and is rising very fast. And the coastline is being defended by seawalls. I think that's an important issue in the Yellow Sea and also Eastern Australia. And I'd probably put sea level rise, perhaps, the human response to sea level rise and other forms of climate change as being probably the most important climate related threat.
Yes, I think, and that was Lee Tibbitts mentioned that in the podcast, that because they winter in the Pacific Islands, some of the first areas they think that will be greatly impacted by rising sea levels. So, and I think it's worth pointing out that when we plant a lot of trees to mitigate and to absorb carbon, they also then have the effect of often harboring a lot of predators. And so we are finding that in Europe, that there's the increase in forest is therefore correlated with more foxes, more crows, more badgers, so to speak. So there's lots and lots of effects. There's nothing that comes, everything has an effect on everything else. Talking about, we haven't got much time left, so I'm going to wind up in a minute, but it seems to me, to listening to all the presentations, that to work on a curlew, whatever form of curlew it is, not only do you have to be a conservationist and a scientist, but you also have to be a social scientist as well, because these birds absolutely do live alongside us, and it's our approach to them which impacts them greatly. And so do you think, and I'd like to go around the room on this one, including Mike, do you think we, people in conservation, give enough sort of credit or enough weight to that social side of conservation and tend to sort of retreat into the science and the sort of conservation side of it, and don't give enough thought to how do we change hearts and minds to get everybody behind working together to save these birds, including maybe changing cultures. So I'm going to start, Mike, I'm going to start with you. Do you think we're winning the battle in Europe?
I rather doubt it. I get more pessimistic the older I get, I'm afraid. But what I did want to say, I'm glad you raised that question. I've been most impressed by the breadth of discussion and the similarity of projects this evening. And I really do applaud you for getting together this webinar and getting people from so far away. It's tragic that there are so few participants. There ought really to have been an awful lot more. Can we somehow build on this to keep up the links which we've started here? And the thing that you've done very much in Britain and extended into Europe is this outreach to people on these social questions. And I wonder if similar organizations aren't required in other continents to pass on the message of just how threatened all these curlew species, even the most numerous ones, are, and how much they intersect with human activities and human development and human industry, and that something like that needs to be taken into account in the in what is loosely called, quote, development. There needs to be room left for the curlews and other species as well. And I don't think that message comes across anything like as loudly as it should. End of rant.
Absolutely. Oh, well, no rant. Also, I have to say 200 people signed up for the webinar tonight, but everybody gets a copy of it, and we do know people do just watch it later. So you, Richard, do you think the social science of conservation is taken seriously enough when it comes to what you're trying to do?
I think it's changing very rapidly. I think there's been a huge push on that front within conservation science. You know, we all have to remember that the biodiversity crisis is caused by us, by humans. And if we are going to solve that, it's about changing our own perception, behaviour, attitudes and beliefs. That's what conservation is. Conservation is not a biological exercise, it's a human exercise. And I think whenever it comes to, you know, the scientists can figure out what the right solutions are, but that means nothing if those solutions cannot be implemented and collectively made to work. You know, in the context of Far Eastern Curlews in Australia, we've been doing a bunch of research on how people interact with curlews and other shorebirds on the intertidal, and looking at attitudes around having dogs off leash and so on, and solving problems like that is inherently a human exercise. We need some data on the effects on the birds, but mostly we need to understand people and their patterns of behaviour, and coming to collective solutions, right? Not lecturing people, but actually trying to work out to collectively, how do we live with nature and make space for nature, so that we can benefit from and enjoy nature, as well as nature thriving and continuing to have its, you know, place in the world. So in the end, this is all about human activity and very little about biology, I think.
Animals and 90% people. Jay, I do know that because I've had some lovely conversations with Heather Hayes, and in fact there's a podcast on the Curlew Action website with Heather, that you do very good outreach, particularly to schools and young people, to try to get the next generation involved in this protecting the long. Is that something that you want to continue and to spread, and do you think it's a very important part of the whole conservation package?
I do, and I was just thinking, I think I'm, alternately fearful given that we have more than 8 billion people on the planet and continuing to consume resources. But on the other hand, I think hopeful, and I tend to always be a little bit glass half full just because it's a better way to be in terms of, an uncertain future. But I think I'm hopeful in that, like you mentioned, we with our bird observatory have done years of, I think, very impactful human outreach to school groups, to adult groups, trying to just spread the information about these birds, that they're not a threat, and try to get people to maybe understand their life history and maybe why that curlew adult pair is screaming at you, and how if you move 100 meters down the road, maybe the problem is solved. But also heartened by the fact that other organizations like Birds Canada, working with private landowners and First Nations in Canada, or other colleagues working with agricultural folks in Mexico, that there are already some of those relationships being developed, and that there is, I think, interest. I think it's just a matter of sort of where the rubber meets the road in terms of economic or financial priorities relative to conservation, which we're always up against. But I do think that kind of education is needed, and I think, unfortunately, you can't just do it once and then go away. It has to be a continuous, in a place like Idaho, where our population has almost doubled in the last 25 years, with a lot of arrivals from neighboring states. We have a lot of new residents that might have missed a program, 5 years ago or whatever. And so I think you do need a constant effort to try to maintain that message about ecology and conservation, whether it's curlew focused or just broadly.
Yeah, absolutely. And Camilo, I know that you go to Iceland to do your research, but in terms of the Whimbrel, do you think that that's an important part of Whimbrel conservation?
Yeah, I mean, they spend most of the year actually in West Africa, but I think at places that are safe currently. So yeah, I think that if we want to preserve that, maybe Iceland has to give the first step. And yeah, I agree with basically everything that Richard, and Jay as well said. But I think definitely people should be aware of the birds and all the issues. But I think that's not enough. But I think that will provide the society with the tools to make decisions. And I think that's where there is a gap still, which is the society. I mean, we need to make decisions. We can either have trees or open habitats. We cannot have both in the same place. And once that decision is made, then maybe things can move faster. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's my feeling where we are still lagging behind.
Yeah, everything is a choice, isn't it? What sort of world do we want to live in? And I think that's it's kind of a big message to end on, but we are absolutely out of time, in fact, slightly over. I just want to thank everybody again for coming tonight. It's been fascinating to hear about curlews of the world, to know where our Eurasian curlew sits in this big picture. And this is a world full of curlews, really. All these curlews are telling us about this amazing planet we live on and the problems that it faces. And I wish every single one of you working to protect whatever species it is the very best. Please keep in touch, and we'll put this up online very soon. And I'm more than grateful for you to coming along tonight. Thanks ever so much, everybody, and for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.